how often does a film fan get to watch Leslie Nielsen in a slasher film? Not often. Most people think of him as a comedic actor, but his turn in horror is interesting. Of course, this one also brings Jamie Lee Curtis back to the subgenre, as a teenage girl pursued by a killer. From this, some would assume this is yet another generic slasher film. But is it? As it is an early slasher genre entry, it was not quite that way yet. So, what is this slasher about? Well, teens being stalked and killed, as expected. But really, what is it about?
Nice hearing from you, Carlos.
A group of kids playing hide and seek end up turning on each other, and one of the kids falls. Years later, at prom, a killer stalks the now-grown kids from that fateful afternoon, killing them one by one. That's basically it. In more detail, the lead here is Kimberly Hammond, played by Jamie Lee Curtis, and she is the prom queen to be. Her father, Mr. Hammond, played by Leslie Nielsen, is the school principal. Her brother is gonna DJ, and her mom will be the chaperone. Quite the family affair. The film, after the initial bit with the kids, moves to showing us high school life at its best in most 1980s self. We get to meet the kids from earlier as soon-to-be grads, a few scares get thrown into the mix, then we get to the prom when things go into disco dancing overdrive, and then the bodies start really adding up. Well, somewhat adding up. Being that this is an earlier slasher film, one with not so much subgenre history behind it, the film follows what most consider the rules now, but not fully. The rules were still being figured out and set in place back in 1980, with Halloween, Black Christmas, and a few others coming before, and most of the big ones, the rule creators, the majors, coming after Prom Night, or the same year in some cases. With that said, the film suffers a bit from aging, the settings, music, wardrobe, and whatnots are as dated as can be, adding a sort of charm to things, but also dating everything a lot. The film overall, over 40 years later, is a solid 7.5 out of 10. Back in the day, it would have scored higher, I'm sure, but with the current films, how the slasher subgenre evolved, and considering the influence the film has had, 7.5 is a solid grade, more than passing, and definitely top-tier, low-budget early slasher. Now, why does it get that rating? Well, it's not perfect, and it has aged, showing cracks in its making and staying power. However, it's still quite a good film, and the work from writer William Gray, from A Story by Robert Guza Jr., shows talent for teenage drama and a bit of the good old violence. Gray had written The Changeling and Blood and Guts before this, and has worked on Humongous, Black Moon Rising, and the series Catwalk since, to name a few. For Guza, Prom Night was his first foray into film, and he has since worked on another classic slasher, Curtains. His other work has mostly been on soap operas, including Port Charles, Santa Barbara, and General Hospital, just about as far from a slasher as can be in most of these cases. Their writing on Prom Night is very much within expectations for a slasher, but it's also interesting how later 1970s and early 1980s, the way the characters interact, the lines written for them, everything is very much of the time period. The directing works with that pretty much perfectly, with the writing in terms of tone and how the film is brought to the screen. Director Paul Lynch has done horror before with Blood and Guts, and has done a variety of films since, including Humongous with Gray, and even a film that has yet to be released. This team had some experience, but not a ton, which may have given them the advantage of fresh minds and eyes onto the genre, bringing new blood to the slashers, which were not that old yet either. The film gained from the presence of Jamie Lee Curtis for sure. She was already an established final girl, so, spoiler, putting her in the final girl part was an easy decision for sure. Her work here is fun and, dare I say, maybe even more interesting than her work as Laurie Strode. Yes, a bold statement, but comparing her take on each, the character Kimberly here is more entertaining and feels like there is more for Jamie Lee to do with her part. Yes, Laurie has Michael to face off against, and he is the superior slasher when compared with the killer here. But Kimberly has a more varied life, a more complete persona. Jamie Lee Curtis kills it here and really has fun. Also, that dance number must be mentioned. It is something else and oh so disco. It's almost painful. Depending on the mood of the day, that dancing is either highly entertaining or completely hilarious. Seeing Leslie Nielsen as the school's principal is one of those things that, to current audiences, leads to expecting more comedy, but Nielsen was already well established as an actor with a wide range of work. Of course, this is something that was fairly unexpected here. His work here is, well, not his best, but he's got limited screen time, so it's not that much of an issue. The rest of the cast is made up of folks that most won't recognize, but their performances are as one would expect here. Some good, some bad, and a bit exaggerated acting here and there, but which it really adds to the fun, to be honest. There's nothing quite like the kill scene in the locker room, something that won't be discussed further just to keep some mystery for those who haven't seen the film yet. That scene is acted in a way that can only make sense in this film and its setting. As it is, it's as entertaining as can be. Now, here's where things get really fun for me. This one is a film that screams 1980 so loudly. Perfect stuff right here in terms of look. The decor, the sets, the clothes, the hair and makeup. Even the lighting and how everything was filmed are so on point that if people were trying to recreate the mood of 1980 this year, this movie should be a reference. The low budget and the fact that it was a horror production created a very specific mix of conditions to lead to the appearance of this film. By that I mean, there was no money to spend on designer duds, no reason to spend on high-priced props. This film made like most horror films with passion and whatever they could find, which gave the suburban look of the film the exact right content for it. The wardrobe looks like what teens would indeed wear. Teens from middle-class families. The houses used, the cars driven are good, but none are overly pricey, showing logical choices for the people involved. Slashers back in the day were mostly populist films, if that can apply here. Some of them are still that way, but films like Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer brought designer duds, expensive cars, huge houses, and expensive everything. Yes, it looks great on screen, but the connection to the public can get lost a bit if the dream isn't fully sold to them. Yes, those are solid slashers, not knocking them at all, just comparing. Prom Night has the middle class in the 1970s and early 80s look, and it feels familiar, it feels like home, and that connects a viewer with the film like nothing else. That is a great aspect to this film and something that sells it so well even now as a nostalgia piece. The cinematography here works so well with these aspects and with the early slasher world. This many years later, the nostalgia plays for a lot here, so younger audiences may or may not connect depending on their knowledge of the era and how much they love slasher films. No shame here. It's a film that works best for those who remember the period and love it, or for super fans of slasher films. The nostalgia and a desire to connect with more modern audiences led the film to become remade in 2008, written by J.S. Cardone and directed by Nelson McCormick. That took things to a more expensive place, moving some of the action to a hotel and giving the killer a much different reason for his killings. Also, the actor playing the killer is clearly older than his victims, another major change from the original. The remake is very much a 2008 movie, glossy, fancy, filled with pretty people. It's not terrible, but it's not as good as the original, and it's clearly a very loose remake of the 1980 film. The cast of the remake is decent, and the kills are brutal, but it feels emptier than the original. It feels like it's just another slasher film in a slew of slashers coming out in the 2000s. Back to the original, being that it was an early slasher film, and some of the slasher rules were not fully set. By those, I mean the rules described by Randy and Scream. Prom Night had some leeway in how to function and still chose to go with the usual. This means this is a revenge story. The killer is not obvious, the reveal is almost shocking, the case is young and hip for the time, and the kills were original at the time. This is not a very scary slasher, or even very tense, but a few sequences are definitely worth looking for this one, and paying attention to it. The girls' locker room sequence, beyond the young cleavage, is interesting to pay attention to and how the tension is built there. So is the sequence when everyone leaves the prom and its dance floor is pure chaos. The chaos is there for a reason. The prom is ruined by more than just the killer. The way the film handles this here is a great example of how to use panic to build tension and then fear on film. The fact that most of the escalation with the killer is in the last third of the film, and that the first 2/3 are entertaining and not boring, shows that this film was well written and well directed. Prom Night, for this viewer, is above Halloween on some fronts, such as the lead character and performance by Jamie Lee Curtis, which feels like sacrilege to say. Of course, Halloween is a classic, one that overshadows a few of the other slashers released within a few years of it. In terms of high school slashers and revenge film, Prom Night has a good mystery, doesn't rely on anything impossible like many others do. The killer comes off as very human, and the reason for the kills are clear, yet the killer isn't completely obvious from the start. The film has some really tense sequences, some good kills, doesn't rely on gore or jump scares, and it really sets a ton early on. This is one of those films that captures the era it happens in perfectly and brings the slasher tropes to the front in a way that was unexpected at the time. Being that Prom Night was released in 1980, only a few other major slashers have seen the light of the projector before, and it was given more room to help create the tropes and to feel more original. Of course, watching it now, it's dated and some of the rules of slashers are clearly in place, but as it helps set them, that's quite easy to look past. Prom Night, like any good slasher film, also spawned some sequels. 3 of them to be exact, with the second film being the better known and loved of the sequels, as well as a remake. The sequels go in some different directions, something that was popular in the 1980s. Prom Night, the OG, is a classic for many reasons, and it's still a great watch over 40 years later.